before. While we still await exact figures, preliminary estimates show that the combined price tag for just hurricanes Milton and Helene will eclipse $170 billion. So far this year, FEMA has provided assistance for 89 presidentially declared emergencies and major disasters, including those covering hurricanes, wildfires, landslides, and tornadoes. One of the main sources for providing support to disaster-stricken communities, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, is FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund, the DRF, which funds repair and restoration of public infrastructure, that supports hazard mitigation initiatives, and it provides financial assistance to disaster survivors. When the program is nearing depletion, however, it enters immediate needs funding, INF, which pauses all DRF-funded projects that are not life-saving operations. Since 2001, INF has been implemented 10 times, the most recent being just August of this year. The current continuing resolution provides $20 billion in budget authority for the DRF, so FEMA is no longer operating under INF. We know, however, these funding challenges will continue as fewer than $5 billion currently remains in that budget. That's why President Biden submitted a $100 billion supplementary request to Congress yesterday, and that includes $40 billion for FEMA. Congress must pass a supplemental to sufficiently fund the DRF so FEMA can continue to support ongoing recovery efforts, as well as address those that will undoubtedly emerge in the future. This funding is not for FEMA, it's for FEMA to provide to communities and individuals impacted. We also need to provide solutions for survivors and communities so they can recover more quickly and ensure that resources are deployed fairly. One of those solutions is my Disaster Survivor Fairness Act, which I introduced with my colleagues Congressman Garrett Graves, Troy Carter, and Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon. Also has the support of Congressman Chuck Edwards, who you will hear from later today. One of the most important aspects of the bill, which has already passed this committee unanimously at the beginning of the Congress, is to simplify the process for seeking assistance following a major disaster. It does this by creating a universal relief application across federal agencies so that we can ease the burden on families and small businesses, get rid of some of the red tape, speed up the process, because this is the worst days of their lives and they need to have at least some assistance in the application process. In this committee, we've held numerous hearings on the challenges faced by FEMA's workforce, and I look forward to discussing those today. As we move forward, however, we must also acknowledge the impact misinformation has on the ability to respond to these events. I was disgusted with the ridiculous rumors that were floating around, cautioning people that government was going to bulldoze over their communities, seize their homes, and divert disaster aid to other programs. And those who perpetuated these claims, spread the claims, claimed that they were legitimate. Well, shame on you. That just makes the process even worse. I was also very upset to learn that a FEMA employee directed her disaster survivor assistance team to skip homes that had Trump signs. I condemn the employee's decision about discriminating with aid. That should never be the case. And Administrator Criswell immediately did the right thing when she learned about this incident by firing the employee and referring the case to the Office of Special Counsel. To my colleagues testifying today and to Administrator Criswell, we recognize the challenges you're facing, and this committee wants to do what it can to help aid you, help those in the recovery process. So I look forward to your testimony and hope that we can stick to the issues at hand and not use this as a springboard to get into politics, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlewoman. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Graves, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Perry, and I do want to thank our witnesses for testifying today. This hearing comes at a crucial time. We're being told the supplemental appropriations bill is needed after Congress recently appropriated $20 billion to the Disaster Relief Fund. There have been ongoing concerns about how long FEMA takes to provide aid and rebuild after a disaster. Further, this committee has highlighted concerns that the Biden administration has prioritized equity, climate change, and assistance to migrants over disaster victims and readiness and response efforts. And then we add on top of all of this the recent shocking reports that FEMA workers purposely avoided hurricane-impacted homes and that displayed signs in support of President Trump. Each of these reports alone are unacceptable, but combined, they show a pattern of incompetence within the agency. And for more than a decade, I have sponsored and supported numerous pieces of legislation aimed at speeding up FEMA aid, cutting the bureaucracy and the red tape, and creating more transparency. But it seems that despite these efforts, FEMA somehow finds new ways to make the recovery process more difficult for impacted communities. The agency is accountable directly to the president, and so the buck stops with the president regarding the constant mismanagement and lack of focus at its core mission. And I trust that under new leadership, we will finally be able to reform FEMA in a way that works to support all Americans and refocus the agency on what it is supposed to do, and that's help people prepare for and recover from disasters without regard to an individual's political views. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Chairman thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the subcommittee ranking, Dean Titus. Just one more speech, and we'll get to the members of Congress panel. But thanks for calling this hearing today. The devastation that Hurricanes Helene and Milton created in the Southeast and Appalachia is gut-wrenching. Over 200 individuals lost their lives to Hurricanes Helene and Milton. The storms have left over $170 billion of damage in their wake. So that's the dollar amount we know of. Damage to water infrastructure in western North Carolina was so severe that much of the region still does not have drinkable tap water. To aid affected communities, the administration approved major disaster declarations for Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. So the recovery will take a lot of work, and we are ready to provide the resources needed. And I'm grateful that Representatives Edwards and Castor are here today to share what they've seen on the ground in their districts as a result. And I think they, along with the rest of Congress, would agree that we have to focus on passing a disaster supplemental immediately. Without funding, federal agencies, including FEMA and the Small Business Administration, cannot fulfill their missions and help disaster survivors. For over a month now, the Small Business Administration Disaster Fund has been empty. In that time, the applications of over 11,000 survivors have been approved for disaster loan assistance, but they will not receive any money until Congress makes more funding available. It's not a new problem. Congress has failed to approve critical long-term recovery funds for disasters in 2023 and 24 that occurred in 21 states, ranging from Alabama and Arkansas to Texas, Vermont, and Washington State. FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund is once again approaching concerningly low levels with less than $5 billion remaining. That sounds like a lot of money, but it is not a lot of money when you consider the cost of these disasters. Disaster survivors should not be left wondering if promised disaster aid is coming. After losing everything, families should be focused on rebuilding their lives, not worrying about congressional dysfunction. Again, this is not isolated to the challenges that the people in North Carolina and Florida are facing. They are challenges that even my constituents are facing from previous disasters. So I would just call on the Speaker to schedule a vote for Congress to consider President Biden's $100 billion disaster supplemental request as soon as possible. Now, in the wake of catastrophic disasters, it's important for Congress and FEMA to take stock of lessons learned. The misinformation that has circulated after recent disasters is creating barriers to recovery and putting disaster relief workers at risk. The presence of misinformation after disasters is not new. After Hurricane Katrina, false reports of widespread looting bred chaos and led to the tragic shooting of civilians, as an example. After the Maui wildfires, bogus claims that the federal government would steal survivors' land were widely circulated, harming those in need of assistance. And however, false rumors following Hurricane Helene, especially in North Carolina, were described by Administrator Criswell as the worst misinformation she's ever heard. These rumors increased distrust in the federal government, resulting in armed threats against FEMA workers in the field and caused some survivors to refuse federal assistance. The spread of misinformation on social media after disasters is increasing. and this committee needs to work with FEMA to find solutions that can contain this phenomenon in the future. Disappointed that the president-elect himself amplified the misinformation by falsely claiming FEMA spent all of their funding on housing undocumented migrants. We can have a difference of opinion on whether that funding should occur, but that information was false. He also said FEMA would provide only $750 to disaster survivors who lost everything, which again is false. To set the record straight, disaster survivors may be eligible for up to $42,500 of home repair assistance and $42,500 of other needs assistance from FEMA, and perhaps the debate we should have is whether that should be increased or not. And it is the responsibility of all members of Congress to correct that record, regardless who is providing the misinformation, and lead rather than amplify, lead in providing good information like Representative Edwards did unapologetically and consistently in Western North Carolina. Now, reports following Helene and Milton also indicate it's still too difficult for survivors to access FEMA assistance. Again, not isolated to Helene and Milton, same problem in my district and many other districts around the country in previous disasters. First, the lack of a universal application for federal assistance means survivors may have to complete separate applications for several federal agencies to receive the assistance they're entitled to. That's why this committee supports Ranking Member Titus's and Representative Garrett Graves' bipartisan bill to create a universal application for federal disaster assistance. Second, I'm troubled by reports that 47% of calls made to FEMA during the week of October 14 through 20 were not answered, and that of the more than 260,000 survivors that registered for FEMA assistance, nearly 50% have been denied. Difficulty accessing this assistance is not unique to this disaster. The Government Accountability Office conducted nationwide interviews about disaster responses occurring between 2016 and 20 and found that FEMA regularly faces challenges managing its call center and field staff. FEMA often responds to high denial rates by saying survivors can appeal their award decision. That is not an adequate response, nor is that an adequate solution. Eligible survivors should have to fill out one application for FEMA assistance, and this should be this command easy. Administrator Criswell gets here, we'll have questions for her, but I do want to thank her for her service to this country as the first female FEMA administrator and for all the positive policies she has implemented during her tenure. I want to thank you all for being here and look forward to our members' views on Helene and Milton. That'll yield back.
Mr. Larson yields. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses and thank you both for being here. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to you. In case you're unaware, there are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you are running out of time, and red means to conclude your remarks. Chair asks unanimous consent that the witness's full statement be included in the record without objection, so ordered. Chair also asks unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing without objection, so ordered. Chair also asks unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. We will now turn to our first panel. With that, Congressman Edwards, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and the members of the subcommittee. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today about FEMA's response to Hurricane Helene in North Carolina's 11th Congressional District. As a former member of this subcommittee, it's a privilege to offer a unique perspective, especially after being on the ground for 7 weeks during one of the deadliest storms to hit the mainland United States in the last 50 years. To put this disaster into perspective, Hurricane Helene took 230 lives across 7 states. 102 of those lives were in North Carolina. And tragically, 80 of those were from the district that I represent. 80 of those were from the district that I represent. Only 3 storms since 1950 have claimed more lives, with Hurricane Katrina being the most notable among those. The storm struck western North Carolina on September 27, 2024. the National Weather Service issued early and dire warnings about the threat of catastrophic flooding, as 10 to 15 inches of rain had already swelled rivers and creeks over the previous 3 days. And while this storm claimed 230 lives, I think it's important for me to tell you that NOAA and the National Weather Service worked expertly to save countless more lives. However, the destruction that followed was immense. In some areas, water crested up to 40 feet above its normal levels, destroying entire communities as it rushed through the mountain valleys, carrying away homes, cars, and roads. And massive landslides crushed many unsuspecting victims while they thought they were in the safety of their homes from the raging waters. In the aftermath, FEMA's response was in some ways effective, but there were significant issues that need to be addressed. FEMA's core responsibility is to coordinate federal emergency management efforts and support state and local officials with critical resources. It seemed to me and many local officials in Western North Carolina that it took up to 3 days before there was any real visibility from FEMA. And that's just simply not good enough. Allow me to put this in perspective. The storm was over on September 27th for all practical purposes at about 10 a.m. We had 1 million people without power. We had 25 water systems destroyed. And for it to take 3 days for the visibility of FEMA is just not acceptable. There were folks in their homes not only without power, they couldn't flush toilets, they had no drinking water. We were shut off from the rest of the world. And I can't help but think, had this been an attack on American soil, should it take 3 days to see any real evidence of help from our federal government? I would hope not. The distribution of supplies in the immediate aftermath of Helene left much to be desired. For example, on day 3, the distribution of supplies in the immediate aftermath of Helene left much to be desired. For example, on day 3 after the storm, FEMA announced to me that it had delivered 400 pallets of desperately needed water to Western North Carolina. But when asked where those supplies had been delivered, FEMA couldn't provide one single location. They deferred responsibility to the state, which left local officials in the dark about where resources were going and who could also not answer my simple question. A major concern in my district was FEMA's slow response in getting boots on the ground in some areas. For example, in one county, FEMA didn't arrive until over a week after the storm. And it wasn't until 20 days later that a disaster recovery center was opened. In addition, FEMA's communication with local governments and the public was inconsistent and at times confusing. On one occasion, FEMA sent out a press release stating that a disaster recovery center would close temporarily without informing local officials, only to retract it hours later after confusion, numerous inquiries, and local demands. Other failures include FEMA personnel changes with little or no notice to county governments, no-shows for scheduled appointments, issuing hotel vouchers to displaced families that could only be redeemed 2 hours from those displaced families' work or school, an inefficient inspection process that slows consideration of critical benefits, and the 50% threshold for substantial improvement and substantial damage definitions and their required actions are riddled with inconsistencies and irrational thinking. I could share with you many other breakdowns in the FEMA response, but 5 minutes is just not enough time. My office has also seen a significant number of casework issues related to FEMA's individual assistance process. Constituents have reported receiving confusing correspondence, especially regarding initial denials, which only adds to the stress and confusion for people already dealing with the aftermath of the storm. I don't share these issues to criticize FEMA or its employees on the ground. Many hard-working men and women are doing everything that they can in incredibly difficult circumstances. However, as Congress, it's our job to conduct rigorous oversight and ensure that FEMA is held accountable and improves upon their processes. We must address the flaws in FEMA's response to prevent further delays and confusion in the recovery process. And in conclusion, the people of Western North Carolina are tired. The grief that they're experiencing is compounded by bureaucratic missteps, delays, and poor communication. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I would welcome any questions that you may have.
We thank the gentleman from North Carolina. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Castor for 5 minutes for her testimony.
Well, thank you, Chair Perry and Ranking Member Titus, Chair Graves, and Ranking Member Larson, and the entire committee for the opportunity to testify before the committee today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with Congressman Edwards. My heart goes out to your community, Congressman. Many Floridians have a special relationship with Western North Carolina. We always think that this is a place that we can go to escape many of the impacts of the extreme hot summer heat. So I don't think there's anywhere you can go right now to escape a lot of these extreme events. So we've got to do a better job providing for our neighbors, strengthening our infrastructure. But this hurricane season was particularly costly and deadly for my community and the state of Florida. Think of the West Coast. Think of from Congresswoman Kamek's district in the Big Bend down through Rep. Bilirakis to Luna to Buchanan over probably Congressman Webster. When Milton came over, it even spawned hurricanes over on the East Coast in Rep. Mass district. So this had really started in August. Hurricane Debbie dumped an extraordinary amount of rainfall, 10 to 14 inches on the state. But the real damage came September 26 with Hurricane Helene. It roared up the Gulf, bringing a record 7 feet, 8 inches of storm surge along the coast. So it has flooded out thousands of homes. It swamped the Coast Guard Air Station. It swamped MacDill Air Force Base, that's the home to Special Operations Command and Central Command. It washed away the navigational, the channel markers for Port Tampa Bay, so fuel could not be delivered. Whole neighborhoods were ruined, businesses ruined. But then 2 weeks after that, on October 9th, with some of our neighbors still in shelters, Hurricane Milton slammed into the state with wind speeds up to 105 miles per hour and a new record rainfall total of up to 18 inches in some areas that they said was a 1 in 1,000 year flood event. So if you survived the storm surge of Helene, it's likely that you were flooded out weeks later by Milton, and many of the rivers took weeks to crest. There were widespread power outages for some people well over a week. This inhibited the ability of small businesses to bounce back. Many of them, these small business owners, you know, are just, they have a very limited range of what they can take. So when power was out, when fuel could not be distributed, when we have police officers guarding gas stations, folks are really asking, there must be a better way. So here are a few recommendations on the aftermath and what I saw leading up to the catastrophes and the aftermath. The misinformation regarding FEMA was a real distraction. It was unnecessary. A lot of time was spent on combating that false information rather than encouraging people to sign up. Communities need to understand where the damage has occurred, and people need those emergency funds right away. I'm grateful for the federal resources and personnel that were surged into the region, including Administrator Criswell being there a couple of times, pre-positioning of resources, search and rescue, the medical assistance teams, but also the guarantee that debris could be cleaned up. Local communities, you would not believe the heartache and the cost of people having their lives out on the street. We've never seen anything like the scale of this. And to be able to say that FEMA is going to be there, the Congress is going to be there to help you clean up your communities is absolutely vital. The massive damage is going to require extensive rebuilding of homes and infrastructure across the area. And Floridians are resilient, but the impact of these back-to-back monster storms is straining our local resources. My neighbors are already spending more on property insurance than any other place in the country. Electric bills are out of sight. They need Congress now to follow through with help in helping them rebuild their lives. What Ranking Member Larson highlighted as the Small Business Administration, there's so many homeowners and businesses that need to tap those low-interest loans. There's nowhere else to turn. You don't want them going on a credit card with those high interest rates to rebuild their lives. We've got to replenish the SBA fund right away. President Biden's proposal of a $98 billion disaster relief bill is good. It's robust, but the Congress now has to take the wheel and make sure that these dollars are getting to where they need to be. I understand the large-scale water and wastewater rebuilding that has to go on in North Carolina, but it's also all across the state of Florida. They were swamped. They polluted our bays, rivers, the Gulf of Mexico, and we're a tourism economy. We cannot rebound with polluted waterways. We've got to be able now to build back stronger, build back in a more resilient way, one that protects the taxpayer dollar so we don't go through this time and time again. Fifth, during widespread power outages, the traditional grid is destroyed. Like I highlighted, it took weeks in some places to get the power turned back on. We've got to be smarter about our electrical systems in this country and build in a more resilient way with microgrids, solar, battery systems that can safeguard our critical infrastructure. We had hospitals lose power with patients inside. We had community health centers massively damaged. We had shelters where people were trying to stay safe and the power went out for weeks. We've got to do a better job making sure that these places are safe and resilient from these extreme weather events. I'll highlight a few other things in written testimony and answers to the committee, but thank you for inviting me to this important hearing today. The heating climate is costing us a lot, and we need to better adapt for our pocketbooks and for our people. Thank you very much for the chance to be here.
Chair thanks our witnesses. Are there questions?
Don't have any questions. I just want to, first of all, tell you how much I appreciate your efforts on behalf of your constituents. I did have the opportunity to visit Western North Carolina with Congressman Chuck Edwards, and just so sorry for what happened to you and your constituents. I know that you're both working really hard to get them back on their feet. I want to thank you for your service, and again, just know that we're praying for y'all's folks, and really sorry that y'all are having to go through this. But thank you.
Others? All right, seeing none, thank you for being here today, and thank you for your testimony and your comments. This concludes the first panel, and I'll give you a couple minutes to go ahead and exit, and we're going to introduce the second panel. Thank you. Administrator Criswell, thanks for your patience here, and thanks for your service. I'm going to welcome you as the FEMA Administrator to our second panel. As a reminder, your written testimony has also been made part of the record, so the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes, and with that, you are now recognized for that 5 minutes. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding FEMA's efforts in response to Hurricanes Helene and Milton. We value this committee's legislative support and oversight of our agency, and I really look forward to our conversation today. On September 26th, Hurricane Helene made landfall in Florida as a powerful, fast-moving Category 4 storm with hurricane force winds extending 40 miles and tropical storm force winds extending 310 miles from its center. Helene then entered Georgia as a Category 2 hurricane before becoming a powerful tropical storm that continued to release historic rainfall over already saturated soils as it marched through South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. There were also impacts in West Virginia and Kentucky. Helene's powerful winds and floodwaters altered landscapes and devastated communities in many places not accustomed to experiencing such storms. The destruction caused by Helene was catastrophic. Less than 2 weeks later, Hurricane Milton rapidly intensified into a Category 5 storm in the Gulf of Mexico. After making landfall in Florida as a Category 3, it moved across the state into the Atlantic, spurring a formation of tornadoes and leaving an overlapping trail of destruction in many communities still reeling from Hurricane Helene and Debbie. Many of these same communities were still recovering from Ian, Adelia, and Debbie from previous years. Our hearts have been heavy with the stories of survivors we have encountered. People who lost their loved ones, their homes, and their businesses. These two catastrophic storms led to the loss of over 200 lives and caused extensive damages to homes and neighborhoods across the impacted states. There was also widespread disruption of critical services across the southeastern United States, including the obstruction of transportation routes, which isolated some homes and communities. FEMA's mission statement is a simple one, spelled out in 7 powerful words: helping people before, during, and after disasters. And in my written testimony, I have provided a detailed account of FEMA's preparation, pre-positioning of assets and personnel, and coordination with other federal agencies in support of our state, local, and tribal partners. I have described in detail how FEMA responded to these 2 storms across 8 states, mobilizing the full weight of the federal government to help impacted areas that were not accustomed to this kind of disaster, prioritizing search and rescue efforts, reopening roads to reconnect hard-to-reach areas, delivering essential food, water, and other supplies to residents, and restoring critical infrastructure. And I have described how FEMA is leading recovery efforts in the impacted states, doing everything we can to cut through red tape and expedite assistance to survivors. This has been a challenging time for our workforce of over 22,000 dedicated, hardworking people, many of whom were also impacted by one of these storms themselves and delayed their personal and family recovery to meet our mission and respond to the disaster. Our workforce persevered through all of the challenges I've just described, and they also persevered through a difficult security environment generated by misinformation about FEMA's work spread through social media. We help all survivors, all people, obtain all of the assistance that they are qualified for under the law, and misinformation was making that work much more difficult. I greatly appreciate the voices from members of Congress from across both sides of the aisle who has attested to the work that FEMA was doing on the ground. So I was very concerned when I learned that a FEMA employee had given direction to her disaster survivor assistance team that were completely at odds with FEMA's mission. A critical function of these teams is to go door to door, meet with survivors, meet them where they are, make them aware of available FEMA resources, and help them register for assistance. This employee wrote to about 11 staffers under her supervision that they should, quote, avoid homes advertising Trump, end quote. My senior leadership team provided me with this visual evidence that the employee had in fact issued this statement, these instructions, and they recommended that this employee be terminated. I concurred and directed the termination, and the employee was fired. I released a statement that day, and I will repeat what I said to all of my employees and the American people. This type of behavior and action will not be tolerated at FEMA, and we will hold people accountable if they violate our standards of conduct. I do not believe that this employee's actions are indicative of any widespread cultural problems at FEMA. FEMA, however, has taken appropriate action to ensure that this matter is fully investigated, and I am committed to ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again. In the meantime, we have sent a different team to the field to contact all of the homes that had been skipped over at this one employee's direction, and that work has been completed. Now, I know that this incident is on the minds of many members of this committee, and I will be happy to answer all of your questions about it. However, I hope that we will also have a chance to discuss the great work of our workforce and responses to both Hurricanes Helene and Milton, as well as the important challenges that lie ahead in the recovery effort across these states. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Administrator, for your testimony. We'll now turn to questions from members. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Administrator, last week we sent a letter signed by myself and all the committee's Republican members to you about the recent allegations that you just mentioned. FEMA workers skipped the homes of supporters of the president-elect. And following the allegations, you issued a statement that one FEMA employee departed from FEMA's values and was terminated. However, she alleges that those were the instructions from FEMA when she was deployed. She asserts that FEMA supervisors and leadership were aware. And independently, we've received reports of similar practices in places like North Carolina. Tell me about the investigation. Tell me about the investigation, who's conducting it, and has there been an IG investigation initiated by yourself or anybody in FEMA?
Chairman Perry, there is nothing in our policies, in our procedures, in our training that would direct any employee to bypass anybody's home based on their political party. I cannot speak to what her motivations were, but this came to my attention again on November 7th. I directed my team to get me information. They gave me factual information on November 9th, which is when I directed the termination of this employee. This first came to our Office of Professional Responsibility on October 28th through the team member from TSA who was working under this individual. She immediately raised it to the Office of the Special Counsel, who took the case as a potential violation of the Hatch Act. There were ongoing investigations with that, and the Office of Professional Responsibility is currently working with the IG to determine what the investigative matters will be going forward. The IG has not of yet stated they want to investigate this, but I highly encourage them to take on this case and look and see if this was a widespread issue or if this was just a single incident.
So you're working with them and you've encouraged them, but you haven't requested they do so. Now, according to your employee, Ms. Washington, who was asked, and this is a public report, these orders came, who she stated, so you're telling me these orders came from somebody above? And she said, correct. So what has your investigation gleaned regarding her direct supervisors, the people above her? Have you questioned them, and what have your answers been?
Chairman Perry, we do have an ongoing investigation, and we have questioned other personnel in this chain of command, and we find no information at this point that there was anything beyond her direction to her employees to skip and bypass a home.
So the same employee alleged that the Florida team had already been avoiding Trump voters' homes prior to her work there, and that this was, as she said, the culture. Now, these aren't my words. These are the words from a FEMA employee who's claiming that she's being the scapegoat. She said, "But I'm just simply executing again what was coming down from my supervisors." Do you know, how many supervisors does she have? How many people above her before she gets to you?
She is a crew lead, which is the lowest level of supervision.
So there's a lot of people above her, so to speak, in
There
the
are
chain of
several
command.
people. I'd be happy to forward an organizational chart that would show where she sits within the organization.
And your investigation has spoken to certainly the immediate and maybe 2 or 3 steps above that?
We have an ongoing investigation, Chairman Perry, to determine if there was any additional acts that violated our core values of compassion, fairness, integrity, and respect.
Okay,
And
so
at
I
this
get there's
time,
an
we have
ongoing
found none.
investigation, but this isn't a law enforcement thing where you can't say, well, we have an investigation, so we can't talk about it. You can talk about this. Does the investigation include her immediate supervisors and several steps above that?
The investigation includes those that were deployed in this particular incident, and we have found no evidence that there is anything beyond this one employee's specific direction.
You found no evidence at this point. Let me ask you this. Now, you can understand that from America's perspective, certainly the people that weren't visited when FEMA was in town, that it would be in FEMA's best interest to just investigate this internally, say this is a one-off employee, that this claim of hers that it's a culture is just her trying to kind of make sure that the responsibility, the accountability doesn't fall on her. Why shouldn't this be an independent investigation by at least somebody like the IG?
The actions that this employee took are unacceptable.
I know that, and you know that. We agree on
And I would
that.
welcome an investigation by the IG.
But you haven't requested. Will you request one?
I will request one.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady, the ranking member from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you. I mentioned in my opening statement about how FEMA in the new reality has to deal with misinformation. And then you heard one of our witnesses, the Congress lady from Florida, mention how it had been a problem as they tried to recover from the hurricanes. I wonder if you could talk to us about what kind of policy or official strategy y'all might be developing to deal with misinformation and how it does indeed hurt your attempts to get relief out to people who've been hit by these disasters.
Ranking Member Titus, we have experienced some level and type of misinformation probably throughout FEMA's history. We have a standard practice of standing up a rumor control page where we can put factual evidence out there. Because part of it is we also have a lot of people that are trying to defraud those that have just lost so much and pretending to be a federal agency such as FEMA to register even on their behalf. So we have had a standing practice of, when we identify this information, of standing up some type of mechanism to ensure that the general public can get factual information from a validated government source. In this case, it would be our source. But we continue to see this rise. We saw an increase in the amount of misinformation during the response to the Maui wildfires. But the amount of information and misinformation that we saw during the responses to Hurricanes Helene and Milton was at a scale that I had never seen before. And so this requires us to now include in our planning and preparedness how we are going to be able to reach people. The goal is not necessarily to take down misinformation, but how do we ensure that people are getting actual correct information so they're not afraid to reach out to their federal agency and apply for the assistance that they need, that they deserve, and that they're eligible for under the law.
Do you provide this information in different languages, and do you work with community leaders who can help you to get the information out, just not elected officers, but church leaders or civic leaders?
We work in a number of ways. For example, during Maui, we had one of our Native Hawaiian employees develop a public security safety announcement and delivered that out through her own social media channels to let people within her community know that they could and should apply for assistance. I remember an opportunity during Hurricane Ida in Louisiana, where we found a Vietnamese community, and we developed information in their native language and sent it out through their channels, and it was one of our most watched videos on FEMA, so we could get them actual information about what resources were available for them. We have a strong network through our faith-based leadership team to reach out to local faith leaders to help us get the information out to individuals and communities that may be apprehensive to try to reach out and apply for assistance. This is a team effort. It takes all of us in this holistic approach to be able to ensure anyone that was impacted by any natural disaster has access to the programs that we have, and that we remove the barriers for them receiving the critical assistance to start their recovery process.
Thank you for that. You know, GAO consistently reports that y'all are drastically understaffed. We've tried to address that by having people be able to take time off and go back to their jobs to go and fight disasters. I think the most recent figure was 35% below what's needed. And we continue to put increasing demands on the agency. We point out how you fail to be there in a certain amount of time, or not enough people on the ground, or not fast enough. But if you don't have the people and the resources to do this work, what can you expect? So could you talk to us a little bit about how you're addressing those staffing challenges and what we might do to be able to help you?
The